In the autumn of 1887, in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood at the edge of a burned lot and offered the only money she had left in the world for a thing the whole town agreed was worth nothing. The lot held the bones of a livery stable that had burned the winter before, and the men who gathered to watch the sale called it a charity to let her have it. $40, she said, and the clerk wrote it down with a smile he did not trouble to hide. What none of them knew, and what she did not yet know herself, was that beneath the black timbers and the ankle-deep ash, there was a room nobody had opened in 11 years, and that what waited in that room would unmake a man the valley had long called honest. Her name was Marin Vale. She had come to the town of Harlow's Crossing 3 weeks before, with a canvas sack, a farrier's apron rolled tight, and a set of tools wrapped in oilcloth that had belonged to a man who was dead. She had no husband, no kin in the territory, and no plan that the townsfolk could understand. They saw a thin woman with auburn hair pinned back hard, and soot already worked permanently into the creases of her knuckles, and they decided what she was before she had spoken a sentence. She let them. She had learned long ago that a low estimate was a kind of cover, and that people told you a great deal while they were busy underestimating you. She had learned her trade from a man named Eli Ferris, a blacksmith and farrier in the Dakota settlements, who had taken her on when she was 14, and orphaned, and who had taught her the way iron speaks before it breaks. He had no children of his own. He taught her the heat of the forge by its color, the soundness of a weld by its ring, the temper of a blade by the way the light ran along it. He taught her that a thing built well carries the hand of the one who built it, and that the hand can be read by anyone patient enough to look. When he died the winter she turned 26, he left her his tools and one sentence she carried like a coal kept alive under ash. "Work the iron honest," he had said, "and the iron will keep your secrets and tell you everyone else's." The livery stable at Harlow's Crossing had belonged to a man named Calder Voss before it burned. That much the town would tell anyone. Voss had built the place in the years after the war and run it well, and when it burned in the winter of 1886 he had grieved publicly, and then with the insurance settlement and a loan from the Territorial Bank, built a finer one across the road. He was a director of that bank now. He sat on the school board. His name was the name people in Harlow's Crossing used when they meant a man who had made himself from nothing and owed no one an apology. The burned lot he had been glad to sell. It was an eyesore, he said, and any fool who wanted to clear it was welcome to the privilege. Marin had not come to Harlow's Crossing for Calder Voss. She had come because the land office in Missoula had a notice of sale, and because a burned livery meant iron, and iron meant work she knew how to do. Hinges, hasps, hand-forged brackets, the great strap bands off the doors, the shoes still nailed in the cinders where the stalls had stood. Burned iron could be cleaned and reforged. A patient smith could pull a season's wage out of a ruin like that, and Marin needed a season's wage more than she needed pride. So she had stood in the cold lot with the men laughing softly behind their hands, and she had bought the bones of the place for $40, and she had moved into the half-standing tack room at the back, with her bedroll and her tools and a lantern. If you have ever been counted out by people who never bothered to learn your name, you already know something of what she felt standing in that lot. Stay with this one. The thing she found changed the way that valley remembered itself, and it began with nothing more than a woman willing to do the work no one else would touch. The first week she did only what she had said she would do. She raked the ash into windrows and let the wind take the lightest of it, gray drifts of it carrying off toward the river, so that by the third day her windrows were dark and heavy with the half-burned things the wind would not lift. She pulled iron from the cinders and laid it out on a canvas in rows, sorting by kind the way Eli had taught her to sort, hinges with hinges, bolts with bolts, the long door bands coiled like sleeping snakes. She tested each piece the way he had shown her, a tap of the small hammer to hear whether the fire had left the iron sound or had burned the life out of it, and she set the sound pieces to one side, and the dead ones to another, and the dead ones she would sell for scrap, and the sound ones she would reforge. She found a horseshoe still nailed to a fragment of stall plank, and worked it loose and turned it in her hand, and saw it had been forged by someone who knew the trade, the heel calks even, the nail holes clean, and she wondered idly who had shod horses here and where he had gone. She found the bones of 2 horses in the back stalls, and she buried them at the tree line, with more care than the town would have thought she owed them, because a thing that suffered deserved the small dignity of being put away clean. She worked from gray light to dark, and she spoke to no one. And the men who passed on the road slowed their wagons to watch the woman grub in the ruin, and then drove on. One boy threw a clod of dried mud at her back, and missed, and his father laughed, and Marin did not turn around. She had been a target before. She knew that the surest answer to it was to keep working until the work itself shamed the thrower, and that the shame, when it came, would come without her lifting her head. It was on the 9th day that the floor told her something was wrong. She had cleared the central aisle down to the dirt, or what she had taken for dirt, and she was raking the last of the ash from the rear of the structure when the tines of her rake rang against something that was not stone and not iron. It was a flat, hard sound, a struck plank sound, and it came from a place where there should have been only packed earth. She knelt and brushed the ash away with the side of her hand. Beneath it was wood. Not the charred remains of a fallen beam, but a fitted floor, planks laid tight and true, scorched on top but sound beneath, and running in a square perhaps 8 feet on a side, in a building whose floor everywhere else was bare ground. She sat back on her heels and looked at it a long time. A livery stable has no need of a wooden floor. The dirt is better for the horses and cheaper for the builder. A wooden floor in a livery meant something had been built to sit on top of it or to hide beneath it, and the scorch told her it had lain under the fire and survived because something had protected it from below. She traced the edges with her fingers and found the seam, a hairline of shadow where 2 worlds of wood met, and following the seam she found the iron ring, flush set into a recess so that no boot would catch it, blackened now. She knew the work of it at a touch. The ring had been forged to fold flat, hinged on a small staple, the kind of fitting a man orders made when he does not want a thing to be found by accident. A trapdoor. A fitted iron ring trapdoor in the floor of a stable that the whole town believed it understood. She brushed the rest of the planks clear and counted them, 8 wide. Each one planed and matched, and she understood that whoever laid this floor had paid for good carpentry and then hidden it under dirt and horses. And a man does not do that for a root cellar of turnips. She did not open it that day. She was a careful woman, and the light was going, and she had learned from Eli that haste in the last hour of work was how good hands got ruined. She covered the planks again with ash, set a charred board across them as if by accident, and went to her bedroll in the tack room. She lay awake a long while, listening to the wind come down off the bitter roots, and she thought about a man who had grieved so publicly for a building he had been so glad to sell. In the morning, she went into town for the first time since the sale. She needed lamp oil, and she needed to be seen needing lamp oil, because a woman who vanished into a ruin and never came out invited the kind of attention she could not afford. Harlow's Crossing was one street of false-fronted buildings facing the river road, a bank with a stone face newer than the rest, a church, 2 saloons, and the mercantile at the center with a porch worn pale by boot leather. The mercantile was run by a widow named Tess Harmon, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with gray coming into her dark hair and forearms that had hauled their own freight for years. She measured out the oil into Marin's can with a steady hand, and she looked at Marin's knuckles where the soot had gone permanent in the creases, the hands of someone who worked iron and not laundry, and she asked, not unkindly, whether Marin meant to dig her own grave in that lot or only her livelihood. Marin said she meant to make hinges. The widow set the can on the counter and looked at her a moment, and said that Calder Voss had made hinges of that place too in his way, and turned a dead barn into a fortune doing it. When Marin asked her what she meant, Tess Harmon's face closed like a door. She pressed her lips together and counted the change into Marin's palm coin by coin, and said only that the lot had a way of being more than it looked, and that Marin should mind her footing in the dark. What she did not yet know was that Tess Harmon had been waiting 11 years for someone to ask the right question, and had long since given up expecting it. That night Marin opened the floor. She worked the iron ring loose first, cleaning the recess with an awl until the ring would lift, and then she set a pry bar under the edge of the trap and leaned her weight on it slow and even, the way you ease a stubborn shoe off a hoof, never jerking, letting the wood decide when it would give. The trap came up with a groan of swollen timber and a breath of air that had been shut away for years, cold and dry and smelling of earth and old paper and something fainter beneath, the smell of a place where the living had not been for a long time. She held the lantern over the opening and looked down a short ladder into a room dug out of the Montana clay, timbered and dry, perhaps 8 feet square and 6 feet deep, and she saw at once that it had not been a root cellar. It was an office. There was a small table and a stool. There was a cot against one wall with a folded blanket gone stiff with age. There was a strong box of black iron in the corner, and there were shelves, and on the shelves there were ledgers, a row of them, the leather spines pale with the bloom that comes on books left in the dark. And there was a smell she had not placed at first, and placed now. The cold mineral smell of a lamp long out, and beside the lamp on the table, a pair of spectacles folded neatly as if their owner had meant to come back for them within the hour. Marin went down the ladder. She did not touch the strong box first, though a poorer thief would have. She touched the ledgers because Eli had taught her that the truth of a thing lay in its working parts and not in its locks, and a ledger was the working part of any man's business. She lifted the first one down and opened it on the table under the lantern, and she read by the light until her eyes burned, and slowly the room around her stopped being a curiosity and became something far heavier. The ledgers were not the records of a livery stable. They were the records of a freighting and supply operation, dated across the years from 1872 to 1876, and they recorded the movement of goods and money along the wagon roads of the territory in a hand that was precise, educated, and not the hand of any man the town had described to her. The hand belonged to someone named in the front of each ledger in a flourish that had not faded. The name was Josiah Mercer. She had heard that name once, in the mercantile, in a way Tess Harmon had pressed her lips together. She closed the ledger and sat in the dark room beneath the burned stable, and understood that she had found something that was going to cost her, and that she was going to keep it anyway. Josiah Mercer, she would learn over the following days, had been the man who built the freighting business that made Harlow's Crossing more than a river ford. He had brought in the first wagons, and graded the first road and run goods up from the railhead when the railhead was 40 miles of mud away, and he had taken a young partner named Calder Voss into the work in 1874 because he was getting old and had no son. In the winter of 1876, Josiah Mercer had died. The town remembered it as a fever. The town remembered that Voss, grieving, had carried on the business alone, and had in time converted the old freight barn to a livery, and had prospered, and had become the honest man whose name meant a man who owed no one an apology. The town did not remember Josiah Mercer well, because Voss had been careful, over 11 years, to let the memory thin. The ledgers told a different account, and they told it in numbers which do not grieve and do not forget. Marin read them across 4 nights, covering the trap each dawn and going about her ironwork each day, so that the town saw only what it expected to see. She was not a clerk, But Eli had made her keep his accounts because he said a smith who could not reckon would be cheated by every man who could, and so she could follow a column and find the place where a column lied. She read by the lantern with a scrap of charcoal in her hand, marking nothing in the ledgers themselves, but keeping her own tally on a board, the way she would lay out a job before she struck the first heat. The ledgers were honest up to the autumn of 1876. Then the hand changed. The precise, educated flourish gave way to a heavier, blunter script, and the entries in that second hand began to do a thing the first hand had never done. They moved money. They recorded debts owed to Josiah Mercer as debts paid, when no payment appeared on the receiving side. They recorded the sale of Mercer's share of the business to Voss for a sum, and the sum was real, but the date was 8 days after the entry that recorded Mercer's death from fever, and a dead man does not sign away his business 8 days after he is in the ground. She found the bill of sale folded inside the back ledger. She held it to the lantern, and she looked at the signature where Josiah Mercer was meant to have sold his life's work to his partner, and because she had spent 14 years reading the hand of the maker in the made thing, she saw what a less patient eye would have missed. The signature was a careful copy. It had the shape of the name, but not the speed of it. A man signs his own name without thinking, in a single unbroken motion worn smooth by 10,000 repetitions, and that fluency leaves a particular looseness in the line. The signature had been drawn slowly with care by a hand watching the original and matching it stroke by stroke. It was the difference between a horseshoe forged by a master in 4 heats and one hammered cold by a man pretending. She had seen that difference all her life. She could not unsee it now. There was one more thing in the room, and she found it on the 5th night, and it was the thing that turned the account from theft into something the law had a harder word for. The strongbox was not locked. That surprised her until she understood it. A locked box invites curiosity. An unlocked box in a hidden room beneath a building you have made worthless and sold to fools is the safest hiding place a careful man can devise, because no one will ever come to look. Inside the box was a leather wallet, and inside the wallet was a letter, and the letter was in the first hand, the precise, educated flourish of Josiah Mercer, and it was dated 3 days before the fever that the town remembered. The letter was addressed to a daughter. Marion had not known there was a daughter. The town did not speak of one, yet the letter spoke of one, a girl named Cora who had been sent east to school in St. Louis, and the letter told her that her father was unwell, that he did not trust the illness, that he had set down the true accounts of the business in the ledgers kept below the freight barn floor, and that if anything should happen to him she was to come to the bank in Missoula and to a lawyer named Pruitt and to demand an honest reckoning of what was hers. The letter never reached Cora Mercer. It had lain in the dark 11 years in the room below the building her father's partner had burned and sold, and it told Marion in a dead man's careful hand exactly what had been done, and exactly who had been robbed. She sat with the letter a long time outside. The wind had dropped and the silence of the burned lot was complete. A lesser story would have her run to the law that next morning. Marion did not, because she had learned from Eli that you do not strike the iron until it is at the right heat, and she understood that a letter 11 years old and a forged signature were not, by themselves, enough to undo a bank director in a town that loved him. A clever lawyer would call the ledgers a forgery, would call her a grasping woman who had salted the ruin with false papers to extort an honest man. She needed the chain to hold from end to end. She needed to know whether Cora Mercer was alive, and whether the lawyer Pruitt in Missoula still drew breath, and she needed the physical truth of the room itself to be witnessed by someone the town could not dismiss as easily as it dismissed her. So she went, the next morning, to Tess Harmon. She found the widow alone in the mercantile in the gray hour before custom, and she set the folded letter on the counter between them, and she said only that she had found something below the burned stable, and that she thought Tess Harmon had been waiting a long time for someone to find it. The widow did not touch the letter. She looked at it the way a person looks at a grave they have visited too many times to weep at any longer. Then she said that Josiah Mercer had been a good man, that he had grub-staked her husband when the fever of a different year had taken everything, that she had never once believed he sold his business and walked off to die, and that she had said so once loudly in 1877 and had learned what it cost a widow to call a bank director a liar in his own town. She had been quiet 11 years. She was not sure, she said, that she had the courage to be loud again. Marin told her she did not need courage. She needed only to come and see, and to remember what she saw. That evening, in the failing light, Tess Harmon climbed down the short ladder into the room below the ash, and she stood among the ledgers and the cot and the folded spectacles, and she wept after all, quietly, for a man 11 years dead whom she had not been able to defend. When she came up the ladder, her face had changed. The fear had not left it, but something harder had grown up beside the fear. She told Marin that the lawyer Pruitt was dead these 6 years, but that his practice had passed to a younger man named Halloran, who kept the old files, and that Cora Mercer, so far as anyone knew, had married in St. Louis and become a woman named Cora Bell, and that a letter to the school there might yet find her. And she said one thing more. She said that the original of the bill of sale, the one Voss had filed to take possession of the business, was on record at the Territorial Land Office in Missoula, and that if the signature in that filed copy could be set beside the true signatures in Josiah Mercer's own ledgers, an honest examiner would see what Marin had seen. The chain was beginning to hold. What followed was not swift, because the righting of an 11-year wrong is never swift, and Marin had no money for haste and no name to command it. She wrote to the school in St. Louis under Tess Harmon's name because a respectable widow's letter would be answered where a strange woman's would not. She wrote to the lawyer Halloran in Missoula and asked carefully what a person would need to bring to him to reopen the settlement of an estate. She kept working the iron all the while, because the iron was her cover and her bread, and because a season's wage was still a season's wage, and a wronged woman still has to eat. She forged hinges and hasps and sold them to the very men who had laughed at her, and they bought them because her work was sound, and not one of them guessed that the woman fitting their barn doors was assembling, plank by plank and letter by letter, the undoing of the man they admired most. Calder Voss noticed her at last in the 3rd week of October. He came to the lot in a good coat, a heavy, well-fed man of 60, with a banker's soft hands and a voice that had learned long ago to sound reasonable. He came on foot alone, leaving his buggy at the road, and that alone told her something, because a man who walks the last 100 yards to a place is a man who does not want to be seen arriving at it. He stood at the edge of the ash and admired the neatness of her work, and told her she had made a tidy thing of a sorry lot. Then he asked her pleasantly whether she had found anything of interest down in the dirt. He asked it lightly, the way a man asks after the weather, but Marin had spent her life listening for the false note in a true-seeming thing, and she heard it. She told him she had found a great deal of iron in the bones of 2 horses. She told him the iron was good and the horses she had buried. She did not tell him about the floor. He looked at her a moment longer than the answer warranted, and then he smiled and said that if she ever cared to sell the lot back, now that it was cleared, he would give her a fair price for it. More than fair, a good deal more than she had paid. She thanked him and said she was not ready to sell. He left, and she stood in the ash and understood that he knew the room was there, and that he had not been certain until this moment whether she had found it, and that he was certain now. He had burned the building to seal the room, she realized. Not for the insurance, though he had taken that too. He had burned it because 11 years of having that room beneath his feet had finally frightened him more than fire did, and a burned lot sold to a fool was a room no one would ever open. He had not counted on a fool who could read iron. The next night someone came to the lot. Marin had expected it, and she had prepared for it in the only way a careful person can, by being elsewhere than where she was expected to be. She did not sleep in the tack room that night. She made a shape of her bedroll that would read as a sleeping woman by lantern light, and she took her blanket and her tools and the ledgers and the letter, wrapped in oilcloth and buried shallow at the tree line beside the horses where no one would think to dig, and she lay in the cold dark at the edge of the pines and watched. A little after midnight, a man came on foot, not Voss, a younger and rougher man Voss had paid, and he carried a can of coal oil and a lantern, and he went into the tack room where the sleeping shape lay. Maren was already moving when she smelled the oil. She did not shout. She walked into the tack room behind the man as he raised the lantern over her empty bedroll, and she said in a level voice that the woman he had come to burn was standing behind him, and that he could go back to Calder Voss and tell him the room was empty and the papers were in Missoula. It was not entirely true. It was true enough to do its work. The man went white and dropped the can and ran. He did not light anything. A frightened man rarely finishes the cruel thing he was paid for when the person he was sent against looks him in the eye and is not afraid. She did not report it. A burned bedroll and a dropped oil can proved nothing against a bank director, and she knew it. She simply moved her sleeping place to the tree line, banked her small fire low, and waited for the post. The letter from St. Louis came first, in the last week of October, addressed to Tess Harmon in a careful feminine hand. Cora Bell, born Cora Mercer, was alive. She was a widow herself now, with 2 grown children and a small house and a memory of a father who had sent her east and, then the world told her, sold everything and died of fever before she could come home. She had grieved that her father had not waited for her. She had grieved that he had not left her so much as a letter. When Tess Harmon read that line aloud in the lamplight of the mercantile, Maren took the 11-year-old letter from the oilcloth and set it on the counter. The letter Josiah Mercer had written to a daughter and never sent, and she said that a letter had been left after all, and that it had simply been kept from her by the man who profited from her grief. The reckoning came in November, and it came the way Maren had built it to come, not as a confrontation, but as a weight of evidence too great to be argued away. The lawyer Halloran rode out from Missoula with a territorial examiner of records, a dry and exacting man named Sweet, whose whole profession was the comparison of one hand to another. They were brought to the lot on a cold, bright morning, with frost still in the shadows of the windrows. Halloran was younger than Maren had expected, careful in his speech, and he had come half believing he would find a swindle, because that was the likelier story, and a lawyer learns to expect the likelier story. They went down the ladder into the room below the ash, the 2 men and Maren and Tess Harmon at the top of the ladder, holding the lantern down to them, and they saw the cot and the folded spectacles and the strong box and the row of ledgers in their bloom of pale mold. The examiner, Sweet, who had expected a fraud and a foolish woman, grew very quiet. He turned the spectacles over in his fingers and set them down exactly where they had lain. He took the ledgers up into the light, one at a time, handling them the way a man handles things that will be evidence, and he sent a rider to the land office in Missoula for the filed bill of sale, and waited 2 days for it without once leaving the matter. And on a plank table set up in the burned lot, under the bright cold sky of a Montana November, he set the filed signature beside a dozen true signatures in Josiah Mercer's own daily hand. The small, everyday signings of a man closing out a column or acknowledging a delivery, and he looked at them through a glass for a long time, moving from one to the next and back, and the men of the town who had gathered at the edge of the lot to watch fell silent as they understood what was being weighed. Then he set the glass down. He said that no man had signed both. He said it plainly, the way a smith says a weld is cold, without heat and without doubt, because the thing was simply so. The fluent name in the ledgers ran the way a name runs when the hand has made it 10,000 times and no longer thinks about it. The name on the bill of sale crept, careful and even. the work of someone copying a shape he did not own. They were not made by the same hand, and an honest examiner could swear to it before any court in the territory, and Sweet said that he would Caldervoss did not come to the lot to see it. He was a careful man to the end, and a careful man does not walk toward the thing that is undoing him. He stayed in his fine house across the road, and the news came to him there, carried by the same townsmen who had carried his name on their lips for 11 years. And the news did to him what no accusation from a strange woman could have done. The examiner's word was filed in Missoula. The estate of Josiah Mercer was reopened. The bill of sale was struck down as a forgery, and the business Voss had built his life and his good name upon was found to have been taken from a dead man and his daughter by fraud. He was not dragged into the street, he was not shot. He simply ceased over the following months to be the man the valley had agreed he was, and there is no fire a man can set that will burn that loss away. Marin did not gloat. When the townsmen who had laughed at her bid came one by one to the lot in the weeks after, some to apologize and some only to look, she met each of them the same way with a level eye and few words, and she did not once say that she had told them so. She had not told them, so she had simply done the work and let the work speak, and the work had said everything that needed saying. Cora Belle came west in the spring. She came on the rail that now ran most of the way to Harlow's Crossing, and Marin met her at the river and brought her to the lot, a small, straight-backed woman near 50 in a traveling dress gone dusty from the road, with her father's brow and a way of holding her hand still in her lap that Marin would come to know. They went down together into the room where Josiah Mercer had written the letter his daughter had waited 11 years to read. Cora sat on the stiff old cot a long while, with the letter in her hands and the folded spectacles beside her, and she touched the spectacles once, and did not pick them up. She did not weep the way Tess Harmon had wept. She had done her weeping years before, for the wrong reasons, and what she felt now was something quieter and harder to name, the strange grief of learning that a wound you had carried as your own fault had been someone else's crime. Her father had not abandoned her, he had loved her, and tried to leave her the truth, and the truth had been buried under ash by the man who killed him. She asked Marin in a low voice how a stranger had come to dig where no one else would, and Marin said only that she had needed the iron, and that the room had been a thing she found while looking for something smaller. Cora looked at her a long moment and said that her father would have liked a person who looked carefully at what others threw away. The settlement restored to Cora Belle the value of her father's business, less the years and the law's slow share, and it was a great deal of money, more than Marin had seen in her life. Cora offered her a part of it. Marin would not take it. She had taken $40 worth of burned iron and turned it into a season's honest wage, she said, and that was the bargain she had made, and the only one she wanted. What she would take, if Cora wished to give it, was the lot, the burned livery, the room below it, the bones of the place. Cora gave it to her gladly, and asked what she meant to do with a thing the whole town had once called worthless. Marin meant to build a forge. By the second summer there was a smithy on the lot at Harlow's Crossing, a low sound building of squared timber and stone with a stone chimney and a wide door that Marin had hung herself on hinges of her own forging. The room below the ash she did not fill in. She floored it properly and timbered it dry, and kept it as it was, the cot and the table and the strongbox and the shelves, and she put the ledgers back upon the shelves where Josiah Mercer had kept them, and she let it be what it had become, which was not a hiding place any longer, but a kind of keeping. Tess Harmon's grandchildren came to see it sometimes, and Marin would let them down the ladder and tell them, plainly and without ornament, that a man had once tried to bury the truth under a building, and that the truth had waited in the dark, patient as iron, for a hand willing to dig. On the anvil in the new smithy, she kept Eli Ferris's hammer, the worn-handled one he had put in her hand when she was 14, and she used it every day until the head of it was as much hers as his. Some evenings when the work was done and the forge banked low and the long Montana light came slantwise through the wide door, she would stand with her hand on that worn handle and think of the old man who had taught her that a thing built well carries the hand of the one who built it. He had been right about the iron. He had been right that it keeps your secrets and tells you everyone else's. He had only failed to tell her that the same was true of a forged name on a bill of sale, and of a letter left unsent, and of a room dug into the Montana clay by a careful man who meant to come back within the hour and never did. Have you ever found that the thing everyone threw away was the very thing that held the truth? I would be glad to know it. And if a story like this one stays with you, there is another I can tell, of a woman, and a ruin, and a wrong made right, waiting whenever you are ready for it. The smithy still stands at Harlow's Crossing, or stood within the memory of people who could tell it true, and the worn hammer hangs above the forge where she left it. That is where the story rests. A woman the town counted for nothing bought the bones of a burned thing for $40, and dug beneath the ash, and brought a dead man's truth up into the light, and never once raised her voice to do it.